The contract of desperation. The city skyline gleamed with cold rain that night. 1,000 lights scattered across the glass towers like jewels on black velvet. Sophia Bennett stood at the edge of that glittering world, clutching her worn handbag as the elevator rose toward the top floor of the Whitmore Tower. Her reflection, in the mirrored doors, looked like a stranger, a young woman who had run out of choices yet still carried the faint hope that dignity could survive desperation. She had told herself, again and again, that this was just a transaction, nothing more. One night, one deal, one way to save her sister's life. Grace's surgery cost more than Sophia would earn in 3 years, working double shifts at the diner. The hospital had already sent the final notice. There were no relatives left, no insurance, no miracles. Only this. When the elevator chimed open on the 43rd floor, a hush greeted her, the kind of silence only money could buy. Soft carpets, sculpted walls, the faint scent of sandalwood and rain. A woman with silver hair met her at the doorway, her voice calm and professional. "Mr. Whitmore will see you soon." "May I take your coat?" Sophia nodded, trying not to tremble. She had never met a man like Julian Whitmore, but everyone in the city knew his name. The youngest tech investor to make the Fortune 100, the mysterious philanthropist who refused interviews, the man who could turn bankrupt companies into gold with a single phone call. Tonight he was paying her $50,000, money that would buy her sister a chance to live. She sat on the edge of a velvet sofa, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The champagne on the table sparkled under the soft light, untouched. Through the tall windows, lightning flashed over the city, illuminating the outline of a piano and an empty armchair facing the rain. "Miss Bennett." His voice came from behind her, deep, calm, and unexpectedly gentle. She turned. Julian Whitmore wasn't what she had imagined. Not the cold, cruel millionaire from her fears, but a man whose eyes looked tired in a way money couldn't fix. He wore a simple white shirt with sleeves rolled up, and his dark hair was slightly mussed, as though he'd been pacing before she arrived. "You look nervous," he said quietly. "I am," she admitted. "I've never done anything like this before." He studied her for a moment. "You mean anything at all?" Sophia hesitated, then nodded. "I'm not proud of it, but I don't see another way." Julian exhaled slowly and poured himself a drink he didn't taste. "You're honest. Most people wouldn't be." He sat opposite her, elbows on his knees. "Tell me why you're here," she swallowed hard. "My sister, Grace, she has a brain tumor. The operation costs more than we could ever afford. The doctor said she doesn't have long." Her voice cracked. "I've tried everything. This was my last option." The room fell quiet except for the steady drumming of rain against the windows. Julian's gaze softened, the mask of indifference slipping for the briefest moment. "How old is she?" 19. He nodded once, thoughtful. "I'm sorry." Sophia blinked, startled by the sincerity in his tone. She hadn't expected pity from a man like him. Then he said something she hadn't prepared for. "You don't have to do this," her breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I'll transfer the money anyway," he said simply. $50,000. "For your sister's surgery. You can walk out of this penthouse right now and no one will ever know you were here." She stared at him, heart pounding. "Why would you do that?" "Because I can," he said, leaning back. "And because I've done enough things in my life that I'm not proud of. Maybe helping someone who still has a little faith left will balance it out." Tears welled in her eyes, unexpected and burning. For 3 weeks she had prepared herself to be treated like a purchase, but this man, this stranger, was offering her freedom instead. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Then let me make it simple," he said. "You don't owe me anything." "Not tonight. Not ever." For a long moment she couldn't speak. The storm outside seemed to echo her confusion. The roar of wind against glass, the pulse of thunder deep in the clouds. Finally she asked, "If you don't want anything from me, why invite me here?" Julian looked away toward the rain-washed skyline. "Because I wanted to see what desperation looks like up close," he said softly. "I wanted to know if it still scares me." "It does." Sophia rose slowly, unsure if her legs would hold her. "Then, what happens now?" "You go home," he said. "Take care of your sister. And forget this night ever existed." She hesitated. "And you?" He smiled faintly, a smile that looked more like sorrow. "I go back to pretending money fixes everything." She stood there for a heartbeat longer, searching his face for the cruelty she had feared, but there was only loneliness. the kind born from too much success and too little love. She reached into her bag and placed a small envelope on the table. "What's that?" he asked. "My sister's photo," she said quietly. "So you know who you helped." Julian didn't pick it up. He just stared at it, as if afraid the image inside might remind him of something he had lost long ago. When Sophia stepped into the elevator moments later, she pressed her forehead against the mirrored wall and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Relief, shame, gratitude, it all tangled together until she couldn't tell one from the other. Down below, the city still shimmered with rain, but for the first time in months, the future didn't look impossible. Somewhere above, in the silent penthouse, a man sat alone with a photograph he couldn't stop looking at. A face that reminded him that goodness still existed in the world, even when he'd forgotten how to believe in it. That night, two people from opposite worlds met for reasons neither could explain. One searching for mercy, the other for redemption. And neither realized that this single encounter would unravel everything they thought they knew about themselves. The promise fulfilled. The following morning, sunlight filtered through thin hospital curtains as Sophia sat by her sister's bedside. Grace's cheeks were pale but peaceful. The surgery had gone better than the doctors predicted. Sophia still couldn't believe it. The encounter with Julian felt like a fever dream, one she didn't want to remember yet couldn't forget. When she checked her phone, the balance still blinked back at her. 50,000, it was real. Every moment of doubt, shame, and confusion had somehow led to this miracle. Grace would live. The doctors called it excellent timing, but Sophia knew better. Someone with a weary voice and sad eyes had made it possible. Days turned into weeks. Sophia found work again, part-time shifts at the same diner, smiling at customers and hiding the exhaustion that came from hospital visits and double hours. Every night when she closed her eyes, she saw Julian's expression in the dim penthouse light. The look of a man who had given her freedom but kept none for himself. She told herself to move on. People like Julian Whitmore didn't linger in lives like hers. But fate, as she would soon learn, doesn't always listen to reason. It began one afternoon when Grace's doctor called unexpectedly. "Miss Bennett," his voice carried quiet excitement. "Your sister's recovery has been remarkable. She'll be ready for physical therapy soon. But there's more. We've received notice that her entire treatment cost, including future therapy, has been paid in advance." Sophia froze. Paid? By who? The donor asked to remain anonymous, but the transaction came through the Whitmore Foundation. Julian. Her heart stumbled. The man had already done enough. Why would he continue? For days she wrestled with it. Gratitude and guilt warred inside her. She wanted to thank him. But how do you thank someone who'd seen you at your lowest? How do you approach a man who tried to vanish from your life? Finally, she decided. She'd go to his company, not the penthouse, but the corporate headquarters where she could face him properly, as an equal if only for a moment. The Whitmore Innovations building loomed like a monument of glass and steel in downtown Manhattan. She felt small beneath it, her reflection distorted across the mirrored walls. Inside, the reception desk gleamed like polished marble. "Do you have an appointment?" the assistant asked politely. "No," Sophia admitted. "But tell Mr. Whitmore that Sophia Bennett wants to return something." Minutes later, she was being escorted to the top floor. The elevator hummed softly, each second stretching longer than the last. When the doors opened, Julian was there, standing beside the same window that framed the city skyline. He looked surprised, but not angry. "You shouldn't have come," he said gently. "I had to," Sophia replied. "You paid for Grace's therapy." His jaw tightened slightly. "And I told you before, you don't owe me anything." "I'm not here because I owe you," she said. "I'm here because gratitude isn't a debt. It's a choice." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Julian gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit." Sophia hesitated before obeying. The office was beautiful, minimalist, elegant, with a quiet hum of wealth that didn't need to prove itself. She noticed the piano again in the corner. Somehow it made the space feel human. "Why do you keep helping us?" she asked softly. Julian turned toward the window. "Because I know what it's like to watch someone you love fade away while you can do nothing. My mother died when I was 20. All the money in the world couldn't save her. I think I've been trying to make peace with that ever since. Sophia's heart ached at the quiet confession. Then you've already done that, she said. Because Grace is alive because of you. He shook his head. No. She's alive because you were willing to sacrifice everything for her. I just happened to have the means to make it easier. Silence settled between them again, but it wasn't awkward. It was heavy with the kind of understanding that doesn't need words. Finally, Julian spoke. What will you do now? I'll work, she said simply. Finish my degree. Maybe start a small art studio one day. Grace loves painting. I want to help her live her dream. Something flickered in his eyes. Admiration, perhaps, or the faint ache of envy. You remind me of who I used to be, he murmured. Before success became a cage, she smiled gently. Maybe it doesn't have to be a cage. Maybe it just needs a window. He gave a soft, genuine laugh, the first she'd ever heard from him. You're not afraid to speak your mind? I'm not afraid anymore, she said quietly. You taught me that. When she rose to leave, Julian walked her to the elevator. Just before the doors closed, he said something that stayed with her for a long time. Sophia, if you ever need anything at all, call me. Not because I pity you, but because I trust you. It wasn't the kind of offer that came from guilt or attraction. It came from respect, from seeing her as someone whose strength humbled his own. And though she didn't know it then, that one promise would change both their lives in ways neither could predict. That night, as she sat beside her sister's hospital bed, Sophia whispered, We're going to be okay. Grace, I can feel it. Something's changing. Grace smiled weakly. You sound happy. For the first time in years, Sophia said. I think I am. Outside the hospital window, rain began to fall again, soft, cleansing, and full of quiet hope. Somewhere across the city, Julian Whitmore stood alone in his penthouse, holding a small photograph of two sisters smiling beneath summer sunlight. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. He didn't know why, but the thought of Sophia's voice, steady, brave, and kind, echoed in his mind long after the night had fallen. When the Savior fell, months passed, and life slowly began to bloom again for Sophia and Grace. The hospital visits became shorter, and laughter began to return to their small apartment. Grace's hair started growing back after the surgery, soft tufts of chestnut against her pale scalp. Every morning she would sit by the window with her sketchbook, painting sunrise scenes while Sophia brewed cheap coffee that somehow still smelled like hope. The world no longer felt like it was collapsing. For once it was expanding. Sophia had taken on new freelance design work, using her late-night hours to build a small online business. She had no office, no equipment beyond her second-hand laptop, but her determination was sharper than ever. She wanted to build something that made her proud, something honest, something that Grace could look up to. But every so often, when the rain fell hard against the windows, she still thought of Julian Whitmore. She wondered what he was doing in his world of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, whether he ever thought of that night, the one where he gave her freedom instead of taking it. She told herself that chapter was closed. Yet fate again had other plans. It started one Friday afternoon with a message, not from him, but from the Whitmore Foundation. Subject, invitation to a private charity. Gala, location, the Grand Manhattan. Hall, purpose, fundraising for pediatric oncology in partnership with the Whitmore Group. Sophia stared at the email for a long time. The irony wasn't lost on her. The charity event supporting children with cancer, the very illness that nearly took Grace's life. She had no reason to attend, no invitation she deserved. And yet at the bottom of the email was a handwritten note scanned into the message. Miss Bennett, I hope you'll consider attending. Your courage reminds us why we do this. Her chest tightened. She didn't know whether to feel gratitude or fear. The gala shimmered beneath a canopy of chandeliers and golden light. Women in elegant gowns and men in tailored suits mingled with champagne flutes in hand, laughter echoing like music. Sophia felt out of place the moment she walked in. Her simple blue dress borrowed from a neighbor, her heart pounding beneath her ribs. And then she saw him. Julian Whitmore stood near the stage, surrounded by business elites and journalists. But his posture was weary, his smile practiced. His eyes, those eyes she would never forget, looked distant, haunted even in success. When their gazes met across the room, It was like the noise faded, leaving only that same quiet pull that had drawn them together once before. He excused himself from his circle and crossed the floor toward her. "You came," he said softly. "I wasn't sure I should. I wasn't sure you would." There was a flicker of warmth in his expression, but it was brief, a mask sliding back into place. "You look different," he said, and then quieter, happier. "Grace is recovering," she said with a small smile. "Thanks to you." He nodded but didn't smile. "How's your work?" "Growing slowly, but it's mine." "Good." He hesitated. "That suits you." Something about his tone made her pause. It wasn't just fatigue. It was emptiness. Before she could ask, the event host called his name. Julian stepped onto the stage to deliver a speech, his voice clear and steady as he spoke about compassion, giving, and responsibility. Yet every word sounded like it hurt him to say. When the applause ended, he didn't stay for long. He excused himself early, his security detail following him out through a side exit. Sophia tried to dismiss it, but something in her gut told her the man who'd once saved her was now drowning in silence. 2 days later, it was confirmed. The morning headlines screamed across every screen. Whitmore Group stocks plunge amid scandal. CEO accused of financial misconduct. Sophia's breath caught. The words didn't make sense. Julian, the man who funded hospitals, rescued families, built charities. The article claimed he'd been accused of embezzling funds from his own foundation, the same foundation that had paid for Grace's therapy. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Sophia, don't believe what you see." "GW." Without thinking, she replied, "Where are you?" There was no response. By evening, reporters were camped outside his company. Social media swarmed with judgment. Investors withdrew. Board members distanced themselves. The empire Julian built began to crumble overnight. Sophia couldn't bear it. She needed to find him, not because he was a billionaire, but because he was human, and once when she had nothing, he had seen her humanity too. After hours of searching, she finally found an address, a secluded coastal estate listed under one of his private holdings. She borrowed a friend's car and drove through the night. The gates were open when she arrived, the lights of the house dim. The ocean wind howled against the cliffs and the sound of crashing waves filled the air. Inside, she found him sitting alone in the dark, staring at the sea through a wall of glass. He didn't turn when she entered. "I told myself you wouldn't come," he said quietly. "You sent me a message," she replied. "Of course I came." He gave a faint, humorless smile. "The press has already decided." "I'm the villain now, are you?" she asked softly. He turned then, and the look in his eyes made her heart ache. "No," he said. "But it doesn't matter. When you have power, people only need a reason to believe the worst." "What happened?" "I trusted someone I shouldn't have. My partner. He moved money through the foundation accounts. Now everything traces back to me." Sophia stepped closer. "You can fight this," he laughed bitterly. "Do you have any idea what happens when people smell blood in business? They don't wait for truth. They just feed." She sat beside him, her hand brushing his arm. "Then don't fight them alone." He looked at her, startled. "Why would you help me?" "Because you helped me when you didn't have to. You gave me a chance to live with dignity again. You didn't know me, but you saw me. I can't forget that." For the first time in months, something softened in his eyes. Gratitude, or maybe something deeper. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "People will think—" "Let them think," she interrupted. "The truth doesn't need their permission." Julian stared at her for a long moment, the storm outside reflected in his gaze. "You're stronger than you know, Sophia. And you're better than you think," she replied. That night, as rain lashed against the windows, they sat in silence, two broken souls finding peace in the company of someone who refused to give up. For the first time in his life, Julian didn't feel like a savior. He felt seen. And Sophia realized that sometimes the greatest act of kindness is not saving someone from their fall, but sitting beside them until they find the strength to rise again. Rising from the ruins, morning broke gray and silent over the Whitmore estate. The sea below roared against the cliffs, restless and wild, as though echoing the turmoil inside the man who once ruled half the corporate world. Julian Whitmore hadn't slept. He sat before a dying fire, his tie undone, his face drawn and pale. Around him, the symbols of power, portraits, polished marble, forgotten awards. now looked like remnants of a life that no longer belonged to him. Sophia woke early, wrapped in a borrowed blanket on the couch. For a moment she forgot where she was. The sound of waves, the faint scent of smoke, the ache behind her eyes, it all came rushing back. Then she saw him, and without a word she stood and made coffee from the half-empty pot she'd found in the kitchen. When she handed him the cup, Julian looked up slowly, weary gratitude in his eyes. "You should go home," he said quietly. "You don't need to be part of this," Sophia shook her head. "I'm already part of it. You helped save Grace. You believed in me when I was at my lowest. Let me do the same for you." He sighed, staring into the coffee like it might hold answers. "You don't understand. They froze my accounts, seized the foundation records, stripped my authority from the board. Everything's gone, Sophia. The lawyers won't even return my calls. Then we'll find someone who will," she said firmly. "Someone who still believes in the truth." Julian almost smiled at that, almost. "The truth," he murmured, "isn't something the world values much anymore." Sophia leaned forward, her voice gentle but unyielding. "Then we remind them why it matters." That day marked the beginning of a quiet war. While the media tore at his reputation, Sophia began to piece together threads others overlooked. She spent hours digging through online filings, donation ledgers, and public financial records. Her part-time work as a freelance designer had taught her patience, and she used that same determination now, stitching fragments of evidence together into a pattern. It didn't take long before she noticed a name that kept reappearing: Victor Lang, Julian's longtime business partner. Several of the transactions flagged in the scandal had passed through shell companies that connected to Lang's offshore accounts. She brought her findings to Julian one evening, spreading printed pages across the table. "Look," she said, pointing. "These donations were rerouted within 48 hours. The foundation reports them as pending disbursements, but the money vanishes afterward." Julian frowned, leaning closer. "Lang had access to these accounts. But how did you—" "I looked at what didn't make sense," she said simply. "I followed the gaps." He stared at her, a mix of disbelief and admiration. "You're not supposed to be this good at this," she smiled faintly. Desperation teaches people to notice things others miss. For the first time in days, Julian's expression softened with something like hope. "If we can trace this to Lang, we can clear my name." "We will," she said. "But we'll do it carefully. You've already lost too much." That night, as rain fell again, the same rain that had witnessed their first meeting, Sophia stayed in the library, sorting through data and making calls. Julian watched from a distance, struck by how the woman he'd once seen as fragile now carried herself with quiet authority. Her hair was pulled back, her face illuminated by the glow of the desk lamp. He realized then that what had started as guilt and pity had become something else entirely. Respect, admiration, and a kind of tenderness he hadn't felt in years. When she finally looked up from the papers, she caught him watching. "What?" she asked, smiling softly. He shook his head. "Nothing. Just wondering when you became the one rescuing me." Sophia laughed under her breath. "Maybe it's your turn to let someone else be strong for you." The following week brought their first breakthrough. An independent journalist, Elena Ruiz, had been investigating Lang's financial activities for months. Sophia reached out, sending a carefully worded message and the documents she'd compiled. Within hours, Elena replied, "Meet me tomorrow. 9 a.m. Café Verona. Don't tell anyone you're coming." Julian was reluctant. "If this goes wrong, it'll only make things worse," he warned. "It's already worse," Sophia said. "At least this way, we fight back." When they met Elena the next morning, she wasted no time. "I've been waiting for someone to confirm what I suspected," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "Lang's been siphoning money through humanitarian accounts for over a year. But without an insider willing to go on record, I can't publish." Julian looked at Sophia, then back at the journalist. "If I give you my statement, my career ends regardless of the outcome." Elena nodded. "Probably. But the truth clears your name and saves the foundation." He went silent for a long time before saying, "Do it." The article broke 3 days later. Truth behind the Whitmore scandal. Partner caught in global charity fraud. Evidence linked every missing fund to Lang's accounts. Emails, transactions, witness statements, all laid bare. The news spread like wildfire. Investors retracted their accusations. The board reinstated Julian within hours. But it wasn't triumph he felt, it was exhaustion. The man who had once stood unshaken before governments now sat in silence, his eyes on the horizon. Sophia found him by the sea again that evening, wind whipping through his hair. "You did it," she said softly. He shook his head. "We did it. Your name is cleared. You could rebuild everything now." Julian's eyes drifted toward the waves. "Maybe I don't want to rebuild what I had. Maybe it's time to build something new, something that matters." Sophia nodded, smiling. "Then start with something real, something human." He looked at her then, and for the first time since she'd met him, his eyes weren't cold or guarded, they were alive, filled with quiet gratitude. "You should take some of your own advice," he said gently. "You've spent so long fixing other people's lives. Maybe it's time you start living yours." She laughed softly. "One day, maybe I will." "Promise me something," he said. "What?" "When that day comes, don't disappear." She smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Only if you promise the same." As twilight deepened over the sea, the mansion no longer felt haunted. The room still echoed with silence, but now it was a peaceful kind, the kind that comes after storms have passed. Julian stood at the window long after she'd gone, watching the lights of her car fade down the winding road. For the first time in years, he felt lighter. The truth was out. The world had judged him, broken him, and somehow, because of her, he had survived. Sophia, meanwhile, drove home with tears she couldn't explain. Gratitude, relief, something unnamed. It all filled her chest like rain ready to overflow. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But she knew this. Sometimes the person who saves you is the one who teaches you to save yourself. The light beyond the storm. The city skyline glowed again with rain. But this time it didn't feel cold or distant. For the first time in a long while, Julian Whitmore looked out at the same horizon that once made him feel powerful, and felt something different. Peace. The empire that had nearly destroyed him was slowly stabilizing. The scandal had burned away the hollow people, the opportunists, the faces that smiled for cameras but never looked him in the eye. The board had reinstated him, yes, but he knew he could never return to being the man who measured worth in profit margins and quarterly gains. The man who sat in that penthouse with whiskey and loneliness wasn't someone he ever wanted to become again. Sophia had changed that. She had given him a glimpse of something money could never buy: humanity. And once he'd seen it, there was no going back. Weeks after the scandal cleared, Sophia returned to her normal life, though normal no longer meant small. Her online design business had taken off after Elena Ruiz, the journalist, mentioned her in an article about everyday heroes who stand up for truth. She now had clients, savings, and a plan to open her own art and design studio, something she and Grace had dreamed of since childhood. Grace's health had stabilized. She could walk, laugh, and even attend classes again. Their tiny apartment had been replaced by a cozy two-bedroom home near the edge of the park. There were still bills, of course, there always would be, but there was also laughter. And peace. Still, every night Sophia would find herself looking at the city lights and wondering if Julian was doing the same. He had become a quiet echo in her life, not forgotten, but felt. Like a memory that refused to fade because it had rewritten too much of who she was. Then one morning a letter arrived, handwritten, no return address. "Sophia, I don't know if I deserve your time again, but I owe you a promise. You once told me to build something human. I've started. I'm founding a new initiative, not a company, not a foundation, I'm something simpler. A project that helps families who can't afford medical care, the way you once couldn't. I'd like your help designing it. Not as a favor, as a partner. If you say no, I'll understand. But if you say yes, I'll be waiting at the same place we first met. Not the penthouse, but the beginning of something better." Julie and Sophia stared at the letter for a long time. Then she folded it neatly, tucked it into her bag, and smiled. The Whitmore Tower had changed. Gone were the security lines and expensive silence. The marble floors were the same, but the energy was different, lighter, more purposeful. At the lobby entrance, she found him standing near the window. Hands in his pockets, dressed not in a suit but in a simple gray sweater and jeans. When he turned, his smile was the kind that needed no introduction. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted, "but curiosity wins every time." He laughed, the same deep, genuine sound that made the space around him feel alive. Then come see what curiosity built. He led her into a sunlit room filled with blueprints, documents, and photos, hospitals, small-town clinics, schools. It's called the Grace Initiative, he said softly, named after your sister. We're setting up partnerships with hospitals to fund surgeries and long-term care for families who can't afford them. No bureaucracy, no profit. Sophia blinked back sudden tears. You named it after her? I named it after what she represents, he said. The reason you walked into my life, the reason I found mine again. For a long time, she couldn't speak. The air between them was filled with all the things words couldn't say. Gratitude, respect, and something tender. Fragile, but growing. Finally, she whispered, You really changed. Julian shook his head. You changed me. In the months that followed, they worked side by side, building something neither fame nor money could ever have created alone. The Grace Initiative grew from a small pilot project to a national network. Sophia became its creative director, designing campaigns and outreach programs. Julian handled funding and logistics, but for the first time his office doors stayed open. His calendar filled not with investors, but with people, doctors, teachers, volunteers, families. There were challenges, long nights, moments of doubt. But there was also laughter, the kind that echoed through hallways that once only knew silence. And slowly, something deeper began to grow between them. Not a fairy tale, not a whirlwind romance, but something built on trust, respect, and shared purpose. One evening, as the last staff left for the night, Sophia found Julian sitting alone by the window, watching the rain again. The same rain that had once witnessed their pain now falling softly against glass. She walked up quietly and said, You still watch the rain? He smiled faintly. It reminds me that everything can start again, clean. Sophia leaned against the glass beside him. You've come a long way. So have you. They stood in silence for a while, the city glowing below until Julian spoke again, his voice quiet but certain. Sophia, he said, when I first met you, I thought I was saving you. But I wasn't. You were saving me from a life that meant nothing. She turned toward him, her eyes soft. You don't need saving anymore. Maybe not, he said. But I still need you. Sophia's breath caught, but she didn't look away. Then don't build walls again, Julian. Not this time. He reached out slowly, like he had all those months ago, and took her hand. Not as a transaction, not as a promise of forever, but as something real. Something earned. Not this time, he said. A year later, the Grace Initiative had branches across the country. Grace herself had become one of its public ambassadors, sharing her recovery story to inspire others. Sophia and Julian continued their work, partners in every sense of the word. Some called them visionaries, others romantics. But those who saw them together understood the truth. Two broken people had found wholeness not by escaping their pain, but by transforming it. The night of the first anniversary gala, Sophia stood on stage, addressing hundreds of donors and volunteers. She wore a simple white gown, her voice steady as she said, This project began not from wealth but from kindness. It began the night someone chose compassion over desire, mercy over power. It began because one man decided that doing the right thing mattered more than being remembered. Her eyes found Julian in the front row. He wasn't smiling, but the pride in his expression said everything words couldn't. And that choice, she continued, didn't just save a life. It created hundreds of new beginnings. The room erupted in applause. Julian rose to his feet, clapping along, his gaze never leaving hers. In that moment, both knew the truth. Redemption isn't a destination. It's a journey walked hand in hand with someone who refuses to give up on you. The storm that had once brought them together was long gone. In its place stood light, laughter, and a promise made not in desperation but in love.